In the hills above Milan, where ancient villas overlook Lombardy's plains stretching toward distant Alps, whose peaks catch morning light like diamonds against velvet, stands a fortress disguised as paradise, a Renaissance palazzo transformed through decades of obsessive perfectionism into sanctuary that is simultaneously masterpiece and mausoleum, palace and prison. Testament to one man's absolute vision and monument to the costs such vision demands when pursued without compromise across 89 years of relentless control. Giorgio Armani, born July 11, 1934, lives still in this villa, rises each morning in rooms where silence echoes louder than conversation ever did, where walls display art collected across continents but witness no family gatherings, where gardens sprawl across acres tended by staff who come and go like ghosts, while the master walks alone among fountains and sculptures and flowering paths that lead nowhere except back to the beginning, to solitude chosen and now inescapable, to success so complete it consumes everything else, leaving only perfection and the terrible emptiness perfection creates when it becomes life's sole purpose.
The villa contains no children's laughter echoing through its halls, no family photographs cluttering its minimalist surfaces, no evidence of the messy vitality that fills most homes where people actually live rather than merely reside. Armani never married, never had children, never built the family that might have inherited his empire and given his obsessive work some purpose beyond commercial success and critical acclaim, and the accumulation of wealth that exceeds any individual's capacity to spend. He chose instead to pour everything into the business bearing his name, to sacrifice personal connection for professional control, to build empire that would survive him but would transfer to no one who shares his blood, to create legacy without heirs. At 89 years old in 2024, Armani remains chairman and sole shareholder of the Giorgio Armani Corporation, still approving every significant design decision, still controlling every aspect of a business employing thousands across continents, still working from the villa that has become both headquarters and hermitage, still maintaining the absolute authority that built his fortune and guaranteed his loneliness. He has outlived his closest collaborators, outlived his siblings who might have understood his origins, outlived the Milan fashion scene that was young and rebellious when he started, outlived most of his contemporaries who retired or died, or sold their businesses to conglomerates while Armani refused every offer, rejected every partnership that would dilute his control. The villa's gardens, magnificent and melancholic, capture this contradiction perfectly. Paths that wind through carefully staged natural beauty, benches positioned for contemplation that no one uses, fountains whose water sounds provide soundtrack for solitude, sculptures displayed with museum precision, but experienced in isolation, paradise built for an audience of one who has everything except the companionship that would make paradise worth inhabiting. The gardens represent Armani's aesthetic philosophy perfected. Control exercised so completely that spontaneity becomes impossible. Beauty achieved through elimination of anything that might disturb visual harmony. Perfection purchased at price of vitality. But the villa and its owner hold darker secrets than mere loneliness, shadows deeper than the absence of family and friends. The mansion witnesses truths about the costs of absolute control, about the psychology required to maintain singular vision across decades, about the human capacity to choose work over love and perfection over connection and legacy over life, about the possibility that success itself can become addiction more powerful than any substance, more isolating than any physical barrier, more demanding than any human relationship could ever be. What tourists photographing Armani boutiques in Milan and New York and Tokyo cannot know, what fashion students studying his revolutionary designs cannot understand, what business analysts calculating his empire's value cannot measure, is the price paid in the villa's empty rooms, in the garden's solitary paths, in the nights when even perfection cannot fill the void that opens when achievement becomes life's only meaning, and achievement alone cannot sustain the spirit through the darkness that eventually claims everyone who lives long enough to see their triumphs turn to dust and their empires face the ultimate question. What happens when the emperor dies without heirs and the palace has no one to inherit it? but to understand how Giorgio Armani built his fortress and became its prisoner, how success transformed into isolation and control became curse, how the most powerful figure in fashion created empire that will die with him, we must travel back to post-war Italy, to Piacenza, where a boy was born into circumstances that should have predicted comfortable obscurity rather than global domination, to the moment when poverty and war and medical school failure conspired to create the conditions from which fashion empires emerge. Humble origins, the story of Giorgio Armani's villa, begins not in Milan's exclusive hills, but in Piacenza, an ancient city in northern Italy's Emilia-Romagna region, where the Po River winds through agricultural plains that have fed Italian civilization since Roman legions marched these roads, where medieval towers still rise above streets that witnessed centuries of prosperity and plague, conquest and commerce, where on July 11, 1934, Giorgio Armani was born into a world about to descend into the catastrophe of another European war that would reshape Italian society and create the conditions from which his empire would eventually emerge. His father, Ugo Armani, worked as an accountant for a transport company, earning steady middle-class income that provided family with comfortable existence by pre-war Italian standards. Not wealthy but secure, not aristocratic but respectable, the kind of solid bourgeois stability that promised children would receive education and opportunities to maintain or slightly improve family's social position. His mother, Maria Raimondi, managed household with the efficiency expected of Italian women of her generation and class, maintaining standards of cleanliness and cooking and child rearing that demonstrated families' respectability despite modest means, creating domestic environment where appearances mattered and neighbors' opinions influenced decisions about everything from Sunday mass attendance to children's school performance. Giorgio arrived as second of three children, positioned between older brother Sergio and younger sister Rosanna, occupying the middle position that psychologists claim produces either mediators who smooth family conflicts or rebels who seek attention through differentiation from siblings who arrived first or last. The Armani children grew up in an apartment that was comfortable without being luxurious, surrounded by furniture that was practical rather than stylish, eating meals that were nourishing rather than refined, experiencing the kind of stable if unexciting childhood that produces either contented citizens who replicate their parents' lives or restless individuals who dream of escape to more exciting destinations and more glamorous existences. The outbreak of World War II in 1939, when Giorgio was 5 years old, disrupted this stability as Mussolini's alliance with Hitler dragged Italy into conflict that would devastate the nation, that would bring Allied bombing and German occupation and civil war and starvation, and the complete collapse of the social order that had seemed so permanent just years earlier. The Armani family survived the war years through a combination of luck and caution, avoiding the worst of the bombing that destroyed industrial cities, avoiding the worst of the fighting that devastated regions where German and Allied forces battled, avoiding the worst of the reprisals that followed partisan attacks and German retaliation, experiencing war as a series of privations and anxieties rather than immediate catastrophes. But war left marks on young Giorgio that would influence his psychology in ways that wouldn't become apparent until decades later, when success brought freedom to express preferences and neuroses that childhood poverty and war had instilled. He learned during these years that security was fragile, that prosperity could vanish overnight, that only things under personal control could be trusted, that depending on others meant vulnerability to forces beyond individual influence. These lessons, absorbed during formative years when personality patterns solidify, would later manifest in obsessive need for control, in refusal to share authority, in inability to trust partners or delegate decisions, in conviction that only absolute personal oversight could guarantee quality and prevent the catastrophic failures that childhood had taught could arrive without warning. Post-war Italy during Giorgio's adolescence in the late 1940s and early 1950s was nation rebuilding from rubble, experiencing both trauma of defeat and excitement of reconstruction. Watching American money and Marshall Plan aid, an economic miracle transform devastated country into modern industrial state. For the Armani family, returning to peacetime normalcy meant father resuming accounting work, mother reestablishing household routines, children attending schools that were gradually recovering from years of wartime disruption, and teacher shortages and damaged buildings that made education sporadic and inconsistent. Giorgio proved adequate but not exceptional student, showing more interest in movies and magazines than mathematics or literature, demonstrating early fascination with visual aesthetics that would later define his career. But that seemed frivolous distraction during adolescence when practical careers and economic security dominated Italian middle-class values. He spent hours studying photographs in cinema magazines, watching Hollywood films that showed glamorous worlds far removed from Piacenza's provincial realities, absorbing images of elegance and sophistication that represented everything his actual circumstances were not, developing internal vision of beauty and style that had no outlet in environment that valued stability over creativity, conformity over individual expression. His family, recognizing that post-war Italy needed doctors more than dreamers, that medical profession offered secure income and social status, that practical careers were only responsible choices for middle-class youth without connections or capital to pursue riskier paths, pressured Giorgio to pursue medical studies despite his clear lack of interest in science or patient care. He enrolled at University of Piacenza's medical school in 1952 at age 18, attempting to fulfill family expectations and societal norms that dictated career paths for young men of his background and circumstances, trying to suppress aesthetic interests that seemed incompatible with serious professional future. The medical school experience proved disastrous for Giorgio, as the mismatch between his interests and curriculum became undeniable, as coursework in anatomy and chemistry and pathology held no appeal compared to the fashion magazines he secretly studied, as the prospect of medical career filled him with dread rather than anticipation. He struggled through 2 years of half-hearted study, failing exams and falling behind cohort, and recognizing that he lacked both aptitude and commitment to succeed in field that demanded total dedication and scientific mindset he simply didn't possess. The breaking point came in 1954 when Giorgio, facing another round of failed examinations and unable to continue pretending interest in medical studies that bored and depressed him, made decision that would determine the rest of his life. He dropped out of medical school, abandoning the secure professional path his family had envisioned, admitting failure that brought shame and disappointment to parents who had sacrificed for his education, choosing uncertain future, pursuing vague aesthetic interests over guaranteed income and social respectability that medical degree would have provided. This dropout decision, perceived by his family as catastrophic failure that demonstrated weakness and irresponsibility, was actually the moment when Giorgio Armani's true trajectory began, when necessity forced him to pursue the creative work he was actually suited for, when eliminating the safe option left only the risky path that would eventually lead to empire. But in 1954, the decision felt like disaster rather than liberation, like the end of prospects rather than beginning of possibilities, like confirmation that he was disappointment to family whose expectations he couldn't meet. At 20 years old, Giorgio Armani had no skills, no connections, no capital, no clear plan, just vague interest in fashion and aesthetics, just sense that the visual world mattered more to him than it seemed to matter to anyone else in Piacenza, just conviction that somewhere there must be life more aligned with his actual interests than the provincial existence that stretched ahead if he accepted conventional career in conventional city, doing conventional work. But conviction without opportunity produces nothing except frustration. And opportunity seemed nowhere evident for medical school dropout in 1950s Italy, where class barriers remained rigid, and fashion industry was concentrated in Milan, and connections mattered more than talent for gaining entry to exclusive world. What happened next was a combination of chance and determination that characterizes many successful careers, as Giorgio discovered that La Rinascente, Milan's leading department store, was hiring window dressers, that visual merchandising required aesthetic sense rather than formal credentials, that the job paid enough to live on and brought proximity to fashion world, even if only from service position rather than creative role. He applied, was accepted, and in 1954 moved from Piacenza to Milan, from provincial city to metropolitan center, from families' disappointed oversight to independence that allowed pursuing interests without constant judgment. The move to Milan marked transformation from Giorgio Armani, the failure who couldn't finish medical school, to Giorgio Armani, the window dresser, who was finally doing work that engaged his actual abilities, who was finally in an environment where aesthetics mattered and visual sophistication was valued rather than dismissed as frivolity. The apartment he rented was tiny. The salary was modest. The work was service labor rather than creative artistry. But for first time in his life, he was where he belonged, doing what he could actually do well, beginning the long apprenticeship that would eventually produce mastery. The 7 years Giorgio spent at La Rinascente between 1954 and 1961, dressing mannequins and arranging displays, and learning how clothes communicated messages about status and aspiration and identity, were the foundation on which empire would eventually be built. The practical education that no school could have provided, the immersion in visual language of fashion that taught him how garments functioned in commercial and psychological terms beyond mere utility. He learned during these years that fashion was about desire rather than necessity, about selling dreams rather than selling clothes, about understanding customers' aspirations and anxieties, and creating images that addressed those psychological needs. But he also learned during these years that service positions had limits, that window dressers were replaceable workers rather than valued creatives, that real power in fashion belonged to designers and buyers and brand owners, rather than to people who arranged their products in glass displays. The lesson was clear. To escape working-class status and achieve the success he increasingly craved, he would need to move from execution to creation, from service to authority, from arranging others' designs to creating his own. By 1961, when Giorgio left La Rinascente to work as designer for Nino Cerruti, he had accumulated knowledge and ambition in equal measure, had developed aesthetic vision and commercial understanding that would distinguish him from competitors, had transformed from provincial dropout into Milan professional with skills and confidence and hunger to prove that the medical school failure had been right to pursue impossible dream. The boy from Piacenza was gone, replaced by a man who would eventually build empire and mansion and fortune that would far exceed anything medical career could have provided, though the costs of that achievement would only become apparent decades later when success was complete and loneliness was total, and the villa in the hills stood empty of everything except one man's perfect, isolated vision. Fashion awakening the period between 1961 and 1975 saw Giorgio Armani's transformation from window dresser, executing others' visions, into designer developing his own aesthetic, from service worker earning wages into creative professional commanding respect, from anonymous functionary in fashion's machinery into emerging talent, whom industry insiders recognized as possessing that rare combination of commercial instinct and artistic vision that produces not just competent designs, but paradigm shifts that redefine what clothing can mean and how fashion functions in society's complex symbolic economy. His appointment in 1961 as designer for Nino Cerruti's menswear line represented enormous professional leap for Giorgio, who at 27 had never formally studied design, had never worked in garment construction, had never created patterns or supervised production, or managed the countless technical challenges that separate attractive sketches from actual wearable clothes. But Cerruti recognized something in the intense young man from Piacenza, saw past the lack of credentials to the sophisticated aesthetic sense and deep understanding of how men actually wanted to dress versus how fashion industry assumed they should dress. Gambled that Giorgio's fresh perspective might yield innovations that traditionally trained designers couldn't achieve. The gamble proved correct as Giorgio, unburdened by design school conventions and uninterested in perpetuating traditional tailoring that had dominated Italian menswear for generations, began experimenting with softer constructions and looser silhouettes and fabrics previously considered inappropriate for men's suits. He questioned why men's jackets required heavy padding and stiff canvas interlinings, why suits had to be formally structured rather than following body's natural lines, why male elegance was defined by rigid tailoring that restricted movement and communicated authority through visual severity rather than relaxed confidence. These questions led to innovations that would eventually define Armani aesthetic. Unstructured jackets that suggested sophistication without declaring it aggressively. Suits that acknowledged male body rather than attempting to reshape it through architecture. Fabrics that draped softly rather than standing stiffly. Designs that whispered wealth and taste rather than shouting them. But during 1960s, while working for Cerruti, these ideas remained experimental rather than revolutionary. Limited by his position as employee executing brand owner's ultimate vision, constrained by commercial realities of business that needed to sell clothes to conservative Italian businessmen who wanted evolution rather than revolution. During this Cerruti period, Giorgio also began developing work habits and psychological patterns that would define his career and ultimately doom his personal life to isolation that success would intensify rather than relieve. He worked obsessively, arriving early and staying late, reviewing samples repeatedly until they met standards only he could articulate, demanding revisions that seemed excessive to colleagues who thought the samples were already acceptable, developing reputation as perfectionist who couldn't be satisfied, who moved goalposts after they had been reached, who required absolute control over every detail regardless of how minor it seemed to others. This perfectionism produced superior results that justified Giorgio's demanding nature in commercial terms. Cerruti's menswear sales grew significantly during years Giorgio designed the line. Critical reception was enthusiastic, industry recognition accumulated. But perfectionism also created personal costs that were becoming evident. No time for relationships that weren't work-related. No energy for social activities that didn't advance career goals. No patience for people who didn't share his commitment to excellence. Growing isolation that accompanied growing success, as colleagues admired his talent while avoiding his company outside work contexts where his intensity was exhausting. In 1965, Giorgio left Cerruti to work freelance, designing for multiple brands simultaneously, building reputation as designer who could be hired for specific projects without requiring full-time employment commitment, accumulating knowledge about different segments of fashion industry from luxury tailoring to mass-market production. This freelance period provided income exceeding what Cerruti had paid, while offering flexibility to pursue various creative directions, to learn different aspects of fashion business, to develop network of industry contacts who would later become collaborators and competitors and suppliers when he eventually launched his own brand. The freelance work brought Giorgio into contact with Sergio Galati in 1966, an architectural draftsman and designer who would become his closest collaborator, his romantic partner, his business partner, his only real friend. the one person who penetrated the reserve that kept others at distance, the relationship that would anchor his personal life for nearly 2 decades, until Galati's death in 1985 would leave Giorgio completely alone in ways that no subsequent relationship would remedy. The partnership was both professional and personal, both creative collaboration and romantic involvement, both business arrangement and emotional connection, functioning on multiple levels that made it central to Giorgio's life in ways that no purely professional or purely personal relationship could have matched. Galati understood fashion's business side in ways that Giorgio didn't, handled administrative tasks and financial management that bored the creative designer, complemented Giorgio's aesthetic vision with commercial pragmatism that kept projects economically viable. But more importantly, Galati provided emotional support and personal connection that Giorgio's obsessive work habits made difficult to establish with anyone else, accepted the demands and idiosyncrasies and controlling tendencies that drove others away, created space in Giorgio's life for relationship that didn't compete with work, but rather enhanced it by reducing other distractions and pressures. In 1973, with Galati's support and partnership, Giorgio took the decisive step of launching his own brand under his own name, moving from designer executing others' visions to entrepreneur building his own empire, from employee whose work enriched brand owners to business owner whose success would benefit himself. The decision required capital they didn't possess, required confidence in market demand for aesthetic that hadn't been tested under Giorgio's name, required willingness to risk failure that could destroy reputation built over previous decades' freelance success. They launched Giorgio Armani S.p.A. with minimal capital and maximum ambition, renting small workshop space in Milan, hiring handful of pattern makers and seamstresses, producing first collection that would either establish brand or exhaust their resources in spectacular failure. The initial collection, shown in 1975, featured the unstructured jackets and soft tailoring and neutral palette that would become Armani signatures, representing fully realized vision that had been developing through years of working for others, that finally found complete expression under brand bearing his name. The market response was immediate and enthusiastic. Italian retailers placed orders that exceeded production capacity. Fashion press praised the innovative approach to menswear that made traditional tailoring seem outdated. Buyers recognized that Armani was offering something genuinely new rather than minor variations on established styles. The success created demand for expanded production, for additional collections, for women's line to complement menswear, for all the growth challenges that successful brands face when market demand outstrips supply capacity. The period between 1975 and 1980 saw explosive growth as Armani expanded from single collection to full fashion house offering menswear and womenswear, accessories and fragrances, multiple price points from haute couture to diffusion lines that made Armani accessible to broader market. The growth required reinvesting every profit into expansion, required managing increasingly complex production and distribution, required maintaining design quality while scaling up operations, required Giorgio's attention to multiply across more products and decisions and challenges than one person could reasonably handle. His response to these demands was to work more rather than delegate, to maintain personal control over every significant decision rather than trusting collaborators, to review every sample and approve every fabric and supervise every photo shoot, and control every aspect of brand presentation, to sacrifice sleep and health and any semblance of balanced life, to ensure that expansion didn't compromise quality, that growth didn't dilute aesthetic vision, that Armani brand meant exactly what he intended regardless of how exhausting maintaining that control became. Galati managed business operations during this explosive growth phase, allowing Giorgio to focus on design and creative direction, creating division of labor that leveraged both men's strengths while maintaining partnership that was working brilliantly in both professional and personal terms. The company they built together during late 1970 was achieving success beyond what either had imagined when they launched brand in 1973, was establishing Armani as major force in global fashion industry, was generating revenues sufficient to consider investments beyond fashion business itself, including the real estate acquisition that would eventually produce the villa. By 1980, Giorgio Armani had achieved what medical school dropout from Piacenza shouldn't have been able to achieve: recognition as leading designer redefining menswear and womenswear for contemporary era, commercial success generating millions in annual revenue, critical acclaim from fashion press and industry insiders, foundation for empire that would continue growing for decades to come. He had proven that the dropout decision was right, that pursuing impossible dream was wiser than accepting safe mediocrity, that aesthetic vision combined with commercial instinct could create success exceeding anything conventional career could have offered. But success brought pressures that were consuming him, isolation that was intensifying, dependence on Galati that was total, and therefore terrifying in its implications for what would happen if partnership ended. The empire was rising, the fortune was accumulating, the fame was spreading. But the foundations were shakier than they appeared to outsiders who saw only triumph without understanding the psychological fragility beneath, the obsessive control that held everything together, the single relationship that prevented complete isolation. The villa was coming, and with it, the transformation of success into fortress, of achievement into isolation, of empire into prison that no amount of beauty or wealth or critical acclaim could make into home. Villa acquired in 1982, at the height of his creative powers and approaching 50 years old, Giorgio Armani made a decision that would define the physical manifestation of his success and symbolize the isolation that accompanied his triumph. He purchased a Renaissance-era villa in the hills above Milan, beginning transformation that would consume millions of lire and years of obsessive attention to create private sanctuary that perfectly expressed his aesthetic vision, while imprisoning him in luxury that eliminated the messy vitality that makes houses into homes where actual life happens rather than where perfection is merely maintained. The property Giorgio acquired was not single mansion, but rather compound consisting of main villa dating from 16th century, several outbuildings that had once housed agricultural operations when a state functioned as working farm, and approximately 15 hectares of land that included formal gardens, agricultural fields, wooded areas, and views stretching across Lombardy's plains toward Milan's distant skyline, and the Alps rising beyond like jagged teeth against the northern horizon. The estate had belonged to an aristocratic Italian family whose fortunes had declined through 20th century's wars and economic changes, who could no longer maintain the property properly, who were relieved to sell to wealthy fashion designer, whose money would preserve buildings that family sentiment valued but family finances couldn't sustain. The purchase price was never publicly disclosed, but property records and contemporary estimates suggested Giorgio paid approximately 3 billion lire, roughly $2 million at 1982 exchange rates, a substantial sum, but not excessive for property of this size and historical significance, representing investment that would appreciate significantly as Giorgio's renovations transformed adequate aristocratic villa into architectural masterpiece worthy of museum classification. The transaction was handled with discretion that would characterize all Giorgio's future property dealings, with minimal publicity and maximum security arrangements, establishing a pattern of privacy that would intensify over decades as his fame grew, and his desire to control public knowledge about his personal life became increasingly obsessive. The villa's Renaissance origins were evident in its classical proportions, its symmetrical facade, its courtyard layout typical of aristocratic Italian architecture from period when wealth was agricultural and power was local, and architectural statements communicated family prestige to neighbors and rivals who understood the symbolic language of pilasters and loggias and carefully calculated roof heights. The main building rose 3 stories above ground level with additional basement spaces that had originally served as storage for wine and provisions, totaling approximately 2,000 square meters of interior space that would require complete renovation to meet Giorgio's standards for both aesthetic perfection and modern functionality. The structure's condition in 1982 was deteriorated, but not ruined. Previous owners had performed minimal maintenance sufficient to prevent catastrophic decay, but not enough to preserve original finishes or update utilities to contemporary standards. The roof needed replacement. The plaster was crumbling. The electrical system was dangerously obsolete. The plumbing was inadequate. The heating was inefficient, and the interior decoration reflected multiple periods of haphazard updates that had destroyed whatever architectural coherence the villa originally possessed. In short, the property was perfect blank canvas for Giorgio to impose his vision without having to demolish recent quality renovations, was sufficiently preserved to maintain historical character while requiring total reconstruction that would make every surface and system subject to his personal approval. Giorgio immediately commissioned a team of architects and contractors to begin renovation that would eventually consume 5 years and costs exceeding 5 times the purchase price. As his perfectionism and changing specifications and insistence on using only finest materials and craftsmen available in Italy drove expenses far beyond initial budgets and timelines that proved meaningless once work actually began, and Giorgio's true requirements became apparent. The architect he selected, whose name he has never publicly disclosed in keeping with his obsessive privacy, understood that Giorgio's involvement would be absolute, that the designer would control every decision from structural engineering to doorknob selection, that the architect's role was to translate Giorgio's vision into technically feasible solutions rather than to propose independent ideas that would be rejected anyway. The renovation philosophy Giorgio established for the villa became template for all his subsequent property acquisitions and design projects. Preservation of historical character through careful restoration of original architectural elements, combined with ruthless modernization of everything else, creating spaces that appeared historically authentic while functioning as contemporary luxury residences, equipped with every modern system and convenience. This approach required identifying which original features deserved preservation and which needed replacement, which historical elements communicated the desired aesthetic, and which were simply evidence of past owners' poor taste or limited budgets. For the villa's exterior, Giorgio insisted on complete restoration to Renaissance purity, removing all later additions that had compromised the original facade's classical balance, repairing stonework with materials matching 16th century originals, replacing roof tiles with handmade terracotta matching original patterns, restoring the courtyard's loggia to its original proportions by removing walls that had enclosed it during some previous renovation. The goal was making the villa appear exactly as it would have appeared to its Renaissance builders, as if 4 centuries of modifications and decay had never occurred, creating historical fiction that was more authentic than actual history, because it represented ideal Renaissance villa rather than the compromised reality that centuries of changing owners and circumstances had produced. For the interior, Giorgio applied his signature aesthetic of neutral minimalism, stripping away all historical decoration that didn't meet his standards, installing new walls and floors and ceilings in materials that suggested Renaissance restraint rather than Baroque excess, creating rooms that functioned as blank backgrounds against which carefully selected furniture and art could be displayed to maximum effect. The walls were plastered in subtle textures, and painted in variations of white and cream and gray. The floors were either restored original terracotta or new stone, selected to complement historical materials. The ceilings were deliberately simple to avoid competing with furniture for attention. The windows were enlarged to bring more natural light, while being fitted with custom frames that appeared historical, but were actually modern fabrications designed to Giorgio's specifications. The villa's 15 principal rooms on the ground and first floors were organized according to classical Italian palace layout. Formal reception rooms facing the main facade and courtyard, private apartments in the wings, service areas relegated to the rear and basement levels. But Giorgio's use of these spaces reflected his actual lifestyle rather than traditional aristocratic patterns. The formal reception rooms became gallery spaces for displaying his growing art collection rather than venues for entertaining guests he never invited. The private apartments became his personal retreat, designed with monastic simplicity rather than the elaborate decoration traditional wealth would have demanded. The service areas were equipped with state-of-the-art systems for maintaining the property, while remaining invisible to anyone in the principal rooms. The renovation included extensive work on the 15 hectares of ground surrounding the villa, transforming neglected agricultural land into carefully designed landscape that appeared natural, but was actually as controlled and manipulated as the building's interiors. Giorgio commissioned landscape architects to create gardens that combined formal elements near the house with increasingly informal plantings as distance from the villa increased, establishing hierarchy that moved from architectural control to apparent wilderness, while never actually allowing uncontrolled nature to intrude on carefully managed aesthetic experience. The formal gardens immediately adjacent to the villa featured geometric parterres planted with boxwood and lavender, gravel paths that crunched pleasantly underfoot, fountains whose water sounds provided acoustic backdrop for contemplation, and carefully positioned benches and sculptures that created focal points for visual interest, while serving no practical function, since Giorgio rarely invited guests to admire them and seldom had time himself to sit and enjoy the gardens he had spent millions creating. Further from the house, the gardens transitioned to landscape park style with winding paths through wooded areas, clearings with views toward distant mountains, meadows left partially wild to suggest rusticity that was actually carefully maintained by staff of gardeners who worked full-time ensuring that apparently natural spaces remained within aesthetic boundaries Giorgio had established. The property's outbuildings were converted to various purposes. One became guest house for the visitors who almost never came. Another became staff quarters for live-in household employees who maintained property but saw employer rarely. Another became workshop and storage for the art collection that kept expanding as Giorgio's wealth allowed purchasing significant works. These outbuildings allowed the main villa to remain exclusively Giorgio's private domain, preventing staff presence from intruding on the perfection he demanded in his personal spaces. Maintaining separation between the working infrastructure required to operate a state of this scale, and the aesthetic ideal that infrastructure existed to support. By 1987, when renovation was substantially complete, and Giorgio moved into the villa permanently, abandoning the Milan apartment that had been his primary residence since arriving in city as 20-year-old dropout decades earlier. The property represented apotheoses of his design philosophy. Every surface and object and spatial relationship had been considered and controlled. Nothing was accidental or unconsidered. Nothing disturbed the coherent aesthetic vision. Nothing reminded occupant of the compromises and complications and messy realities that fill most people's homes, where actual family life creates disorder that perfection cannot accommodate. The villa was perfect, and perfection, as Giorgio would learn over the decades he lived in this self-created paradise, is the enemy of life, is incompatible with the vitality that relationships require, is achievable only through elimination of everything that doesn't serve singular vision, including the human connections that give success its meaning and solitude its terror. The palace was acquired. The fortress was complete. The prison was ready for its single permanent occupant, who would spend the rest of his life maintaining perfection, while discovering that perfection maintained is not the same as life lived, that beauty without love is decoration rather than meaning, that controlling everything guarantees loneliness as completely as it guarantees aesthetic satisfaction. Empire ascending the period between 1987 and 2000 saw Giorgio Armani's fashion empire reach its zenith, expanding from successful Italian brand into global luxury, conglomerate generating billions of dollars annually, establishing presence in every major market from New York to Tokyo to Dubai, creating diffusion lines that made Armani accessible across price points from haute couture, costing tens of thousands, to Armani exchange items affordable to middle-class consumers, proving that single designer's vision could support commercial structure, rivaling those of heritage French houses that had dominated luxury fashion for centuries before Italian designers challenged their supremacy. The villa during these years served as both refuge from and headquarters for this expanding empire, as Giorgio increasingly worked from home rather than Milan offices, as technology made remote management feasible in ways that hadn't been possible when he first purchased the property, as his desire to control business operations from sanctuary, where no one could observe his methods or question his decisions, grew stronger with each passing year. The villa's transformation from residence into command center reflected Giorgio's psychology, his need for absolute privacy, his distrust of anyone outside his direct control, his conviction that business success required personal oversight of every significant decision, regardless of how exhausted such oversight left him. During this period, the Armani brand expanded into new categories beyond fashion: fragrances that became massive commercial successes, cosmetics that competed with established beauty brands, home furnishings that allowed consumers to purchase Armani aesthetic for their living spaces, hotels that offered immersive Armani experiences, restaurants that extended the brand into dining, even real estate developments in Dubai and other markets where Armani-designed residences commanded premium prices from buyers wanting to live in spaces bearing the designer's imprimatur. Each expansion required Giorgio's approval and design input, required his reviewing samples and approving marketing and ensuring that brand extension maintained standards that he would accept, adding layers of responsibility and decision-making to workload that was already consuming his every waking hour. The company's structure during this expansion phase remained deliberately unconventional. Giorgio retained sole ownership rather than selling equity to investors or going public, refused partnerships with luxury conglomerates like LVMH or Kering, who aggressively acquired brands during 1990's consolidation wave, rejected every offer to sell control regardless of how lucrative the terms, maintained absolute authority over business that employed thousands and generated revenues exceeding $1 billion annually. By late 1990s, this refusal to share ownership or control reflected his pathological need for total authority, but also his legitimate concern that outside investors would compromise aesthetic vision for short-term profits, would force design decisions he couldn't accept, would transform Armani from reflection of his singular vision into committee-designed product indistinguishable from other luxury brands. But sole ownership also meant sole responsibility, meant every decision ultimately depended on Giorgio's judgment, meant the business functioned only as long as he remained capable of providing the obsessive attention it demanded, created structure that had no succession plan because admitting need for succession would mean acknowledging that his control would someday end, and the empire would transfer to someone who didn't share his blood or his vision, or his willingness to sacrifice everything else to maintaining standards that made Armani legendary. The The villa witnessed this empire building from behind its walls. As Giorgio spent increasingly long hours in the private office he had created in the villa's best-lit room, reviewing designs faxed or later emailed from Milan headquarters, conducting meetings via telephone and eventually video conference, managing global business without leaving sanctuary, where he felt safe from the demands and judgments and presence of others who might question his methods or challenge his authority. The isolation that had begun as preference was hardening into necessity, as Giorgio found he could no longer tolerate the chaos of normal office environments, could no longer handle the small talk and social performances and collaborative compromises that workplace relationships require, needed the villa's perfect silence and absolute control to function at level business demanded. Staff who visited the villa on business noticed its emptiness, remarked on how impersonal the spaces felt despite their beauty, how little evidence existed that anyone actually lived in these perfect rooms rather than merely maintaining them between museum visits. The furniture looked unused because it mostly was. The kitchen appeared pristine because Giorgio ate simply and rarely. The bedrooms remained immaculate because he slept alone and made his own bed with military precision. The bathrooms sparkled because obsessive cleaning was constant and use was minimal. The villa was showcase for design philosophy, but not home where life's mess accumulated. Was display space rather than dwelling place. Was monument to aesthetic achievement that happened to include bedroom where owner occasionally slept between work sessions that consumed nearly all his waking hours. During late 1990, Giorgio's fame reached levels where his privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain, as paparazzi stalked the villa's perimeter hoping for photographs that could be sold to tabloids hungry for celebrity content. As fans attempted to locate the address that Giorgio never publicly disclosed, as his reclusiveness itself became part of his mythology, and therefore increased public fascination with the private life, he was desperate to protect from scrutiny. His response was to increase security measures that transformed the villa into fortress. Higher walls, more cameras, additional guards patrolling the grounds, legal actions against publications that revealed too much about the property's location, obsessive protocols designed to prevent anyone without explicit permission from approaching the house. The irony was apparent even to Giorgio in his rare moments of self-reflection. The more successful he became, the more isolated he needed to be. The more his empire expanded, the more he withdrew from human contact. The more people wanted access to him, the more desperately he needed solitude, creating vicious cycle where success fed isolation, that fed deeper isolation, that fed neurotic behaviors that made isolation seem necessary rather than chosen. That transformed preference into compulsion, into prison from which wealth and fame offered no escape because they were the very things that made escape impossible. The villa's grounds during this period reflected this growing isolation. Giorgio walked the gardens alone in early morning before staff arrived, contemplated sculptures with no one to share observations, sat on benches positioned for conversation that never occurred, inhabited paradise created for an audience that didn't exist. The gardens were perfect but empty. The fountains played for no one's enjoyment except his own. The carefully arranged vistas framed views that only he experienced, creating beauty that seemed increasingly pointless when experienced in solitude, that raised questions about whether aesthetic achievement had meaning beyond the satisfaction of controlling it. By 2000, as new millennium began and Giorgio approached his 66th birthday, the empire had reached scale where its continued growth seemed automatic, where brand momentum and established market position generated revenues through processes that didn't require his constant innovation, where business was mature enough that maintaining success was more important than chasing expansion. But maintaining success required defending market share against new competitors, required preventing brand dilution as products proliferated, required ensuring that Armani in 2000 meant the same thing it had meant in 1980, Despite expanded scope and different market conditions and evolution in fashion aesthetics that couldn't be ignored, Giorgio's response to these maintenance challenges was to work harder rather than smarter, to review more samples rather than trusting team members, to make more decisions personally rather than delegating to subordinates, to increase rather than decrease his involvement despite age and exhaustion that should have suggested reducing workload. The villa became prison where warden and prisoner were the same person, where freedom to leave existed theoretically, but not practically, because leaving would mean losing control, and losing control would mean risking the catastrophic failures that childhood poverty and war had taught could destroy everything if vigilance faltered for even brief moment. The empire was ascending, the fortress was secure, the isolation was total, and Giorgio Armani, master of fashion, emperor of style, sole owner of billion-dollar business, walked alone through perfect gardens in perfect villa in perfect silence that should have felt like triumph, but increasingly felt like punishment, like sentence he had imposed on himself through choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but whose accumulated costs were becoming apparent as youth faded and health declined, and the decades of solitude ahead seemed less like achievement than abandonment, less like sovereignty than exile. The peak was reached, and from peaks, the only directions are down or staying exactly where you are, maintaining position through endless effort, defending territory against erosion, holding ground until strength finally fails and gravity claims what ambition lifted. Absolute control, the tragedy of Sergio Galati's death in 1985 from AIDS-related complications, occurring just 3 years after Giorgio purchased the villa, and while renovations were still underway, marked the moment when Giorgio Armani's isolation transformed from preference into permanent condition, when the one relationship that had provided emotional connection and personal intimacy was severed, leaving him alone in ways that no subsequent relationship would remedy despite occasional attempts to find companionship that might fill the void Galati's absence created. Galati had been Giorgio's anchor to human connection, the person who understood both the professional genius and the personal neuroses, who could joke about the perfectionism that others found exhausting, who saw beneath the controlled public persona to the insecure boy from Piacenza who still feared poverty and failure, despite all evidence that both were now impossible. Galati had managed the business operations that bored Giorgio, had handled the social performances that Giorgio found draining, had provided the emotional support that allowed Giorgio to function at level his work demanded, had been lover and friend and partner, and the closest thing to family that Giorgio allowed into the fortress he was building around his private life. When Galati died at age 47, Giorgio lost the only person who had penetrated his defenses, the only relationship that had mattered more than work, the only connection that had prevented complete isolation. The grief was profound but private, expressed through work rather than through the mourning rituals that help most people process loss, internalized rather than shared because sharing would have required vulnerability that Giorgio's psychology wouldn't permit. He threw himself into the villa's renovation with even greater intensity, as if perfecting the property could somehow compensate for the person who would never live there with him, as if aesthetic achievement could substitute for the relationship that had made success meaningful rather than merely impressive. The years following Galati's death saw Giorgio's control issues intensify from personality trait into defining pathology, as he compensated for lost personal connection by tightening grip on business operations, by refusing to delegate decisions that he previously had shared with Galati, by insisting on personal oversight of every aspect of company operations from design to manufacturing to marketing to retail presentation. The need for control became compulsion, became the organizing principle around which his entire life revolved, became the fortress walls that protected him from further loss by preventing the intimacy that makes loss possible, that guaranteed solitude, but also guaranteed against the pain that Galati's death had inflicted. At the villa, this control manifested in obsessive maintenance routines that required staff to follow precise protocols for cleaning and gardening and general upkeep. Protocols that specified which cleaning products to use on which surfaces, which hours were appropriate for outdoor work that might create noise, which paths through the garden staff should use to avoid disturbing areas that Giorgio might want to walk through later without seeing evidence of their presence. The staff learned to move through the property like ghosts, completing their tasks efficiently and invisibly, understanding that their employer valued perfection maintained over any human interaction their presence might occasion. The household Giorgio established at the villa in the late 1980 and maintained through subsequent decades consisted of approximately 15 full-time employees organized in hierarchy that ensured he dealt mainly with single estate manager who coordinated all others, preventing need for Giorgio to interact with people whose functions he understood in abstract, but whose individual personalities were irrelevant to the services they provided. The staff included housekeepers who cleaned the villa's numerous rooms, gardeners who maintained the 15 hectares of grounds, security personnel who monitored the property's perimeter, a chef who prepared meals Giorgio rarely ate with anyone else, a driver who transported him on the rare occasions when he left the property for anything other than business, and various specialists who handled specific tasks from maintaining the art collection to managing the wine cellar that Giorgio had stocked, but seldom visited since alcohol interfered with work focus. That was his primary relationship. Communication with staff occurred primarily through written notes rather than face-to-face conversations, through messages left with the estate manager rather than direct instructions, through systems designed to minimize personal interaction while maintaining the smooth operations that perfection demanded. This indirect management style reflected Giorgio's discomfort with the messy human dynamics that employment relationships create, his preference for treating staff as functions rather than people, his conviction that personal distance made relationships more professional even as it made them less human. The villa's design facilitated this isolation by separating staff spaces from the areas Giorgio actually inhabited, by including service corridors that allowed staff to move through the building without being seen, by incorporating technology systems that reduced need for face-to-face service, intercoms rather than bell pulls, automated climate controls rather than staff adjusting temperatures, surveillance cameras that allowed Giorgio to monitor property without leaving his office, modern conveniences deployed to minimize human contact while maximizing control over environment. During the 1990s, as the empire expanded and business demands intensified, Giorgio's work schedule became even more consuming, often working 16-hour days 7 days per week, sleeping only 5 or 6 hours per night, eating irregular meals at irregular times, maintaining pace that would have challenged someone decades younger, and that was actively destroying his health despite wealth sufficient to afford any medical care or lifestyle modification that doctors might recommend. But recommendations for balance and rest and reduced stress went unheeded because work was not merely occupation but identity, not merely job but purpose, not merely what he did but who he was, making separation between Giorgio Armani, the person, and Giorgio Armani, the brand, increasingly difficult to maintain. The control extended beyond business and household to every aspect of life where control was possible. Diet restricted to simple foods prepared exactly as specified. Exercise following rigid routine of morning walks through gardens on predetermined paths. Sleep in bedroom maintained at precise temperature with specific bedding, changed on exact schedule. Daily rhythms following patterns that varied only when business emergencies demanded deviation. This regimentation reflected both desire for control and deep anxiety about the chaos that might result if control faltered, if routines were disrupted, if the carefully managed environment allowed unpredictability to intrude. Social life during these decades was virtually non-existent outside business contexts, as Giorgio declined invitations to events that didn't serve professional purposes, avoided the Milan social scene, where he might have encountered friends and contemporaries, limited interactions to business meetings and occasional industry functions that attendance required for brand visibility, but that he found exhausting and left as quickly as politeness permitted. The villa became not just residence but refuge from the social demands that most successful people accept as part of the lifestyle their achievements have earned, became sanctuary where he could avoid the performances that wealth and fame typically require, became the place where control was absolute and therefore where he felt safe. Romantic relationships after Gelati's death were brief and unsatisfying. Attempts to find connection that Giorgio's psychology couldn't sustain. Relationships that ended when partners realized that Giorgio's true relationship was with his work, and that they would always be secondary to business demands that consumed his time and attention and emotional capacity. He attempted several relationships during 1990s and early 2000s, mostly with significantly younger men who were attracted by his wealth and fame, but who couldn't tolerate the isolation and control and emotional unavailability that came with being Giorgio Armani's partner, who wanted access to glamorous lifestyle, but discovered that his actual lifestyle was work and solitude rather than parties and travel, and the luxurious indulgences they had imagined. The pattern was consistent: initial attraction based on Giorgio's wealth and status, period of dating where partner gradually understood the reality of his life, growing frustration as partner realized that Giorgio wouldn't change his routines, or reduce his work hours, or prioritize relationship over business, eventual breakup, when partner accepted that Giorgio was incapable of the emotional availability that relationships require, leaving Giorgio alone again, and increasingly convinced that solitude was preferable to the inevitable disappointment that relationships brought. After several such failures, he essentially abandoned attempts at romantic connection, accepting that his life structure couldn't accommodate partnership, that his psychology wouldn't permit the vulnerability that intimacy requires, that he would live alone except for staff who served rather than shared. By early 2000s, the villa had been his primary residence for over 15 years, and the patterns established during that time had hardened into unbreakable routines that defined his existence. Wake before dawn, walk the gardens alone, work through morning reviewing designs and making business decisions, eat simple lunch alone, work through afternoon, walk gardens again in early evening, eat simple dinner alone, work until midnight or later, sleep briefly. Repeat the cycle endlessly with minimal variation, except when business travel required brief escapes from the fortress that had become both sanctuary and prison. The isolation was total. The control was absolute. The loneliness was profound. And Giorgio Armani, who had built empire through refusal to compromise vision or share authority, who had created aesthetic that defined era and influenced generations, who had achieved wealth and fame, exceeding anything he could have imagined as medical school dropout in 1950s Piacenza, walked alone through perfect gardens in perfect villa maintaining perfect empire that gave his life meaning and purpose, but couldn't give him the connection that makes success feel like victory, rather than just another form of solitude. Solitary Summit, the decade between 2005 and 2015, saw Giorgio Armani enter his 70s, while maintaining absolute control over empire that continued growing even as its founder aged and competitors whispered about succession plans. He refused to acknowledge publicly or address privately in ways that might compromise the total authority that defined both his business strategy and his psychological needs. At 71 in 2005, Giorgio showed no signs of reducing his workload or preparing for transition that mortality makes inevitable regardless of how wealthy or powerful or controlling the individual might be. Maintaining pace that would challenge executives half his age, while insisting that only he could make the creative and strategic decisions that Armani's continued success required. The villa during these years became increasingly fortress-like as security measures intensified in response to growing concerns about personal safety for one of fashion's wealthiest individuals, about privacy invasions by paparazzi and fans, about the general sense that wealth of his magnitude required protection against threats both real and imagined. Additional security cameras appeared throughout the property. Guardhouses at entrance gates became more elaborate. Staff with security training replaced general maintenance workers in some positions. Technology systems allowed monitoring property remotely and maintaining awareness of anyone's presence anywhere within the 15-hectare compound. But the enhanced security also reflected Giorgio's growing paranoia about the outside world. His sense that only within the villa's walls did he have complete control. His increasing discomfort with any situation where he couldn't dictate terms and manage outcomes. His withdrawal from the minimal social interactions he had previously tolerated into almost complete isolation, broken only by business meetings. He couldn't avoid and rare public appearances that brand visibility required. The villa that had started as luxury residence was becoming bunker, was transforming from home into hiding place, was evolving into manifestation of psychology that saw threats everywhere outside its walls and safety, only in solitude where control was absolute. Daily life followed rhythms established over previous decades with increasing rigidity, as any deviation from routine created anxiety that disrupted his focus and made him irritable with staff, whose minor variations from protocol reminded him that perfect control remained elusive despite his best efforts. He ate the same foods prepared the same ways, walked the same garden paths at the same times, sat in the same chairs working at the same desks, reviewing designs and financial reports and marketing proposals, with the same critical eye that had built empire, but was now perhaps preventing necessary evolution, because his standards were calibrated to aesthetic sensibilities formed in 1970, and might not fully account for changes in market preferences and competitive landscapes. The fashion industry itself was changing in ways that challenged Giorgio's assumptions about how luxury brands should operate. As digital marketing and social media and influencer culture, and fast fashion and sustainability concerns, and younger consumers with different values and expectations, created environment where traditional approaches that had succeeded for decades no longer guaranteed continued success. But Giorgio resisted adapting to these changes, insisted that Armani would maintain its standards regardless of market pressures, argued that quality and craftsmanship would always find audiences willing to pay premium prices, rejected suggestions that brand needed modernizing, or that his personal aesthetic might need updating to remain relevant to contemporary consumers. This resistance to change reflected both legitimate conviction that compromising standards for temporary market trends would ultimately damage brand, and also reflected old man's stubborn refusal to acknowledge that world had changed, while he was busy controlling every detail of empire that existed in past more than present. His designs during this period became increasingly conservative, retreating toward established Armani codes rather than pushing boundaries as he had done during 1970s and 1980, when he was revolutionary force rather than established institution, becoming predictable rather than innovative, offering refinements of past successes rather than new visions that might excite younger consumers who hadn't grown up worshiping Armani as their parents' generation had. The business performance during this period showed concerning trends. Revenues plateaued rather than growing. Profit margins compressed as operating costs increased faster than sales. Market share eroded as competitors offered alternatives that younger consumers preferred. Brand perception shifted from cutting-edge to classic, which sounds positive but actually signals that luxury brand is losing its aspiration value for demographics who drive growth. The financial reports that Giorgio reviewed during his marathon work sessions contained warning signs that the empire was mature and possibly declining, that without succession planning and renewal, the business would gradually lose relevance, that his refusal to share control or prepare successors or adapt to market changes was putting at risk everything he had built. But acknowledging these problems would require admitting that his control was insufficient, that his vision was fallible, that his judgment could be wrong, that the empire needed fresh perspectives and younger leadership and willingness to evolve, that his psychology couldn't accommodate without experiencing existential crisis about identity and worth. So instead he worked harder, reviewed more samples, made more decisions personally, tightened control rather than loosening it, convinced that the problem stemmed from insufficient oversight rather than from the ossification that absolute control inevitably produces when maintained too long by someone too old to remember what innovation felt like when it flowed naturally rather than being forced through effort. The villa witnessed this decline as Giorgio spent increasingly long hours in his office staring at financial projections and market analyses that told stories he didn't want to hear. As he paced the gardens alone trying to understand why the approaches that had built empire were no longer generating growth, as he sat through video conferences with executives whose suggestions he would mostly reject, while complaining later to absent Gailotti's memory that no one understood the vision anymore, that standards were slipping, that the business was surrounded by mediocrity and what it needed was excellence that apparently only he could provide. His health during these years showed effects of decades of overwork and stress and sleep deprivation, and the isolation that was consuming him from within even as his fortune continued growing through financial management that was professional, even if business growth was stagnant. He suffered from various stress-related conditions that doctors treated with medications and advice he mostly ignored, from chronic back pain that required physical therapy he rarely attended, from digestive problems that reflected both poor eating habits and anxiety that his mind couldn't acknowledge but his body expressed through symptoms that no amount of wealth could cure, because their causes were psychological rather than physiological. The villa's emptiness became more oppressive as Giorgio aged, as the silence that had once felt peaceful began feeling suffocating, as the perfection that had satisfied for years began seeming pointless when experienced in isolation that had become permanent rather than temporary, as the realization grew that this is how he would live until he died, alone in beautiful house, walking beautiful gardens, controlling beautiful business, accumulating beautiful objects, achieving beautiful nothing that beauty without connection could provide. He occasionally invited colleagues to the villa for business meetings, but these visits only emphasized its emptiness as guests remarked on the impersonal perfection, on the absence of family photographs or personal mementos, or evidence that anyone actually lived in these museum-quality spaces, on the coldness that no amount of aesthetic sophistication could warm, on the sadness that emanated from perfection, maintained at cost of vitality sacrificed. The guests would leave, returning to homes where mess and noise and human presence created the disorder that Giorgio had eliminated from his environment, but that his visitors recognized as the evidence of life actually being lived rather than merely maintained. Social media during this period brought new pressures as unauthorized photographs of the villa occasionally appeared online despite his security measures. As fans discussed his private life in forums where speculation and rumor replaced facts he refused to provide. As his reclusiveness itself became subject of fascination that increased public interest in the very privacy he was trying to protect, he responded by increasing legal actions against privacy violations, by threatening lawsuits against publications that revealed too much, by demanding platform removals of posts containing unauthorized villa photographs, by fighting battles that couldn't ultimately be won in an era when information wants to be free and wealth attracts curiosity that legal threats only intensify. By 2015, As Giorgio approached 81 years old, the villa had been his primary residence for nearly 3 decades, had witnessed his 70s pass in solitary devotion to empire that was profitable but not growing, had contained countless hours of work and minimal hours of human connection, had served as stage for life lived in service of aesthetic vision that produced objects of beauty, but couldn't produce the relationships that make success feel like achievement, rather than just another task completed on endless checklist of accomplishments that accumulate without adding up to meaning. The summit was lonely. The empire was secure but stagnant. The control was absolute, but achieving nothing except maintenance of what already existed rather than creation of anything new. And Giorgio Armani, fashion emperor, aesthetic dictator, sole owner of billion-dollar business, walked alone through gardens he had created for audiences who never came, lived alone in villa he had perfected for life he never lived, maintained alone the empire that would die with him because he had built it to require his absolute control, and absolute control cannot be transferred, can only be maintained until the one person capable of maintaining it finally loses capacity that mortality eventually claims from everyone regardless of wealth or will or desperate need to hold on forever to the only thing that gives suffering meaning. Empty halls. The years between 2015 and 2020 brought Giorgio Armani into his 80s, an age when most fashion designers have long since retired or sold their businesses, or at minimum, reduced their active involvement to emeritus roles that provide dignity, without demanding the exhausting daily oversight that building and maintaining luxury empires requires. But Giorgio showed no signs of stepping back, maintained the brutal work schedule that had defined his adult life, continued insisting on personal approval of every significant decision, from which fabrics to use in next season's collection, to which cities should host new boutique openings, to which celebrities should receive complimentary clothes for public appearances that would provide valuable brand exposure. The villa during these years became increasingly tomb-like despite, or perhaps because of, its perfect maintenance and museum-quality aesthetic, as the rooms that had never been particularly lived in took on quality of memorial to life unlived, of spaces preserved rather than inhabited, of perfection achieved at cost of vitality sacrificed. The furniture that Giorgio had so carefully selected decades earlier remained in the same positions, gradually becoming historical artifacts rather than functional objects, accumulating value as museum pieces, while losing meaning as components of actual living space, where human activities might disturb their perfect arrangement. Daily routines continued with diminishing energy, as age finally began imposing limits that willpower couldn't overcome, that decades of ignoring physical needs had made inevitable, that wealth couldn't prevent or medical care couldn't reverse. The morning walks through gardens became shorter. The work hours became slightly reduced, though still excessive for someone in their 80s. The travel required for business became noticeably more taxing. The facade of tireless leadership began showing cracks that even Giorgio's formidable control couldn't completely hide from executives and staff who saw him struggling with energy levels that had once seemed limitless. But acknowledging physical decline would mean confronting mortality that Giorgio's psychology couldn't accept, would mean addressing succession questions he had avoided for decades, would mean admitting that the control that defined him would eventually end regardless of how desperately he clung to it. So instead, he pushed through fatigue, minimized health problems that doctors warned required attention, maintained appearance of strength that was becoming performance rather than reality, protected the myth of indispensability that justified his continued control, while preventing the planning that could have ensured his empire's survival beyond his inevitable death. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, brought unprecedented challenges as global lockdowns closed retail stores, canceled fashion shows, disrupted supply chains, and created economic crisis that threatened luxury brands already struggling with changing consumer preferences and digital disruption. For Giorgio, isolated in villa that had been his refuge for decades, the pandemic's forced isolation was merely intensification of lifestyle he had chosen long before virus made quarantine mandatory, was validation of his conviction that safety lay within walls he controlled, and danger came from outside world that he had been avoiding anyway. But the pandemic also exposed the vulnerability of empire built around single individuals' absolute control, as travel restrictions prevented Giorgio from visiting factories and ateliers and retail locations, as video conferences replaced in-person meetings that had allowed him to evaluate products and presentations with the physical proximity his judgments required, as the limitations of his age and the impossibility of maintaining previous oversight became apparent to executives who had to make decisions without his approval, because waiting for his input would have meant dangerous delays in responding to fast-moving crises. The villa during pandemic lockdowns became even more isolated as staff reduced to essential personnel, as visitors were prohibited entirely even for business purposes, as Giorgio found himself truly alone in ways that previous self-imposed isolation hadn't quite achieved. The silence that had once felt peaceful became oppressive. The solitude that had once felt like sanctuary felt like abandonment. The perfect gardens offered no comfort when walking them alone became not choice, but only option available. When isolation was no longer voluntary withdrawal from social obligations, but rather mandatory separation imposed by circumstances beyond even his control. During this period, industry speculation about Armani's future intensified as observers questioned whether octogenarian designer could guide brand through crisis, requiring rapid adaptation and innovative thinking, whether his refusal to appoint successor or prepare transition plan was responsible leadership or dangerous hubris, whether his sole ownership that had been asset during growth years was now liability, preventing the capital infusions and strategic partnerships that might help brands survive pandemic's economic devastation and emerge positioned for recovery when restrictions eventually lifted. But Giorgio responded to these questions with characteristic defiance, insisting that Armani would survive because quality and craftsmanship always found audiences, that his vision was timeless rather than trendy and therefore would outlast temporary crises, that suggestions he should sell or appoint successors came from competitors hoping to acquire undervalued asset, or from executives ambitious to claim power he wasn't ready to relinquish. He was 86 in 2020, was clearly declining physically, was obviously unable to maintain the pace of previous decades, but admitting these realities would have meant surrendering the identity that work provided, would have meant confronting the emptiness that retirement would reveal, would have meant acknowledging that his life had been sacrifice that produced empire, but not the connections that make sacrifice worthwhile. The villa's empty halls during these years echoed with absence. Absence of family who had never gathered there. Absence of friends who had never been invited. Absence of Galati, whose death 35 years earlier had left void that no subsequent relationship had filled. Absence of the human vitality that makes houses into homes rather than museums preserving aesthetic achievements for audiences who never arrive. The art collection displayed on walls was worth millions. The furniture was museum quality. The gardens were meticulously maintained. But perfection without presence is decoration rather than meaning, is achievement without purpose, is evidence of control exercised but not of life fully lived. Staff who had worked at the villa for years or decades noticed Giorgio's increasing fragility, his more frequent confusion about details he had previously commanded with perfect recall, his growing tendency to repeat instructions or forget conversations that had occurred just hours earlier, his occasional disorientation in villa that had been his primary residence for over 30 years. These signs of cognitive decline were concerning, but not surprising for someone in his late 80s who had spent decades sleep-deprived and stressed and isolated. in ways that medical research consistently shows accelerates mental deterioration, that produces decline more severe than normal aging would explain. But acknowledging decline would require interventions that Giorgio's need for control couldn't accept, sharing authority with executives who could handle increased responsibilities, appointing advisors who could evaluate whether his judgments remained sound, creating oversight mechanisms that would protect brand from decisions made by someone whose capacities were diminishing. These reasonable measures were impossible for a man whose entire identity rested on his singular vision and absolute authority, who couldn't distinguish between helping the brand and diminishing himself, who would rather risk empire's future than admit present incapacity. The villa witnessed these declines in silence, its perfect rooms containing increasingly imperfect occupant who shuffled through halls that had once known his vigorous stride, who sat staring at gardens that had once inspired contemplation, but now just filled time between work sessions that grew shorter as energy failed, who lived alone with staff who served but didn't share, who maintained routines that were becoming empty rituals performed from habit rather than purpose, who faced each day with diminishing resources but undiminished need to control environment that was becoming harder to manage as faculties faded. By 2024, as Giorgio approached 90 years old, the villa stood as monument to choices made and costs paid, to success achieved and connections sacrificed, to empire built and loneliness earned, to perfection maintained at price of vitality abandoned. The building was immaculate, the gardens were perfect, the art was priceless, the control was absolute, and the man who had created this paradise walked alone through its empty beauty, maintained alone its impossible standards, inhabited alone its perfect isolation, discovering that winning requires winning something worth having, that controlling everything means experiencing nothing beyond control itself, that reaching summit means standing alone at elevation, where no one else can breathe. Succession silenced the question that hangs over Giorgio Armani's empire like sword suspended by fraying thread is simple and terrible. What happens when he dies? At 89 years old in 2024, having survived to age when most contemporaries are long dead or retired, maintaining sole ownership of business worth billions, despite every conventional wisdom suggesting that concentrated ownership in single aging individual creates dangerous instability. Giorgio has still not publicly answered this question in ways that would provide certainty to the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depend on Armani's continued viability, to the investors in Armani's bonds and business relationships, to the fashion industry watching one of its most powerful figures approach mortality, without succession plan visible to outside observers. The villa contains no heirs who will inherit in the traditional sense, no children to whom Giorgio can transfer ownership and authority, no family members trained in business operations and qualified to assume leadership, no obvious successors who combine design talent with business acumen and vision necessary to guide global luxury brand through increasingly competitive and rapidly changing market conditions. Giorgio never married, never had children despite relationship with Galati and subsequent romantic involvements, never created the biological legacy that provides most fashion dynasties with succession solutions that keep businesses within founding families for generations. His few remaining relatives, nieces and nephews descended from his siblings, have no apparent involvement in the business beyond whatever financial provisions Giorgio has made in estate planning that he refuses to discuss publicly, beyond whatever inheritances they might receive when he dies, beyond possible board positions or advisory roles that wouldn't constitute actual operational control over empire, that requires leadership from someone who understands both fashion and luxury business at levels that cannot be quickly learned or easily transferred through inheritance alone. The speculation about succession has intensified as Giorgio ages, as industry observers note his physical decline and question how much longer he can maintain the absolute control that has characterized his entire career. As competitors and potential acquirers position themselves for possible opportunities that his death might create if estate planning proves inadequate, or if inheritors decide to sell rather than attempt continuing operations. Without founder's vision and authority, the speculation focuses on several possible scenarios, each with different implications for the brand's future and the villa's fate. One scenario involves sale to luxury conglomerate like LVMH or Kering, who have expressed interest in acquiring Armani for decades, but have been consistently rejected by Giorgio's refusal to sell, or even discuss partnerships that would dilute his control. Upon his death, whoever inherits ownership might decide that selling to professional luxury group makes more sense than attempting to operate business they don't understand, might accept offers that Giorgio rejected during his lifetime, might conclude that converting ownership into liquid wealth is preferable to maintaining operating business, with all its risks and complexities and demands on time and attention that heirs might prefer to spend otherwise. This scenario would likely result in Armani brand continuing, but under corporate management that would implement changes Giorgio resisted. Modernization of aesthetic to appeal to younger consumers, cost-cutting to improve profit margins, brand extensions beyond categories Giorgio approved, integration into conglomerate structure that would eliminate independence Giorgio considered essential to maintaining standards. The villa in this scenario might be sold separately or retained as corporate retreat, or converted to museums celebrating Giorgio's legacy. Its fate depending on whether new owners saw value in maintaining property that has no operational purpose beyond symbolism and historical significance. Another scenario involves creating foundation structure similar to what other fashion designers have established, where ownership transfers to charitable foundation that maintains brand according to founder's vision, while using profits to support causes the founder value. That insulates business from commercial pressures, while ensuring perpetuation of design philosophy and quality standards that founder established. Giorgio has mentioned this possibility in rare interviews where succession questions couldn't be entirely avoided, has suggested that foundation might be appropriate vehicle for ensuring his aesthetic vision survives his death, though he has provided no details about what such foundation would look like, or how it would actually operate, or who would control it, or what causes it would support. The foundation scenario would probably preserve the villa as headquarters or museum or both, would maintain property according to Giorgio's standards as demonstration of his aesthetic philosophy, would open at least parts of estate to public or scholarly access that would study his work, and preserve his legacy beyond commercial operations that foundation would oversee. But this scenario requires careful legal and financial planning that may or may not have been completed despite decades when such planning was obviously necessary. Requires appointing trustworthy trustees who will honor Giorgio's intentions rather than using foundation structure to enrich themselves. Requires funding sufficient to maintain operations while supporting whatever charitable activities the foundation commits to pursuing. A third scenario involves management buyout where senior Armani executives who have worked under Giorgio for decades pool resources to purchase company, maintaining continuity of leadership while transferring ownership from founder to team that understands business intimately, even if they lack his singular vision and absolute authority. This scenario would preserve Armani as independent brand rather than absorbed into conglomerate, would maintain some connection to founder's philosophy through executives trained under his oversight, would avoid the radical changes that corporate acquisition might impose, while allowing evolution that may be necessary for brand survival in contemporary market. But management buyout requires that executives have capital to finance purchase, or can secure financing that banks would provide based on business projections and brand value. Requires that Giorgio's estate would accept their offer rather than seeking higher prices that conglomerates might pay. Requires that executives who have spent careers following Giorgio's instructions can successfully lead company without his oversight, can make strategic decisions they previously deferred to founders' judgment, can evolve brand without destroying what made it valuable while avoiding stagnation that would result from merely continuing his approaches without his talent. The villa under management buyout scenario would likely be sold unless executives see strategic value in maintaining it, unless they calculate that property's symbolic importance justifies costs of upkeep and security, unless they conclude that using villa for brand events and product launches and executive retreats creates value exceeding what selling property would generate. The decision would be purely economic rather than emotional, would depend on calculations about return on investment rather than sentiment about preserving founders' private spaces, would probably result in sale to private buyer who would maintain it as luxury residence or convert it to boutique hotel or high-end event venue. What makes this succession uncertainty particularly poignant is that Giorgio has had decades to plan, decades to prepare successors, decades to create transition mechanisms that would preserve his legacy, while acknowledging mortality that age makes undeniable. But his psychology couldn't accept sharing control during life or planning for its transfer after death, couldn't distinguish between prudent succession planning and premature surrender of authority, couldn't overcome the conviction that only his personal oversight could maintain standards that made Armani legendary, couldn't face the terror that admitting mortality brought to man whose entire identity rested on work that wouldn't survive his death without planning. He refused to undertake. The villa witnesses this refusal daily, contains the man who built empire but won't prepare for its continuation, houses the aging emperor who must know his reign will end, but acts as if denial can prevent inevitability, shelters the creator who achieved everything, except the wisdom to let go before letting go is no longer choice, but merely what happens when death claims what life built. The empty halls echo with succession silence, with questions unanswered, with futures uncertain, with legacy endangered by the same need for control that created the legacy in the first place. And so the villa stands, perfect and endangered, maintained immaculately while its future remains unclear, inhabited by man approaching 90 who has planned every detail of decorating and landscaping and security, but apparently hasn't planned the most important detail of all. What happens to everything he built when he can no longer build or maintain or control it? When absolute authority finally meets the absolute end that no amount of wealth or will can prevent or postpone beyond the limited span that human bodies allow. Fortress maintained today in 2024, as Giorgio Armani enters his 90th year. The villa in the hills above Milan continues functioning as fortress against time and change and mortality, maintained with obsessive attention to detail that produces perfection hiding desperate denial, that creates beauty masking fear, that demonstrates control compensating for the loss of control that age inevitably brings regardless of wealth or determination or elaborate systems, designed to preserve what cannot ultimately be preserved when human bodies fail and human minds decline. And the emperor discovers that empire doesn't protect against aging any more effectively than poverty does. The daily routines at the villa continue with modifications that age necessitates. Shorter walks through gardens that seem to expand as his energy contracts. Longer rest periods between work sessions that accomplish less than they did when mind was sharper and decisions came more easily. More assistance from staff who handle tasks he previously insisted on managing personally. Gradual surrender of absolute control, not through choice, but through diminishing capacity that makes delegation necessary for tasks that no longer seem worth the exhausting effort they require from someone whose reserves are depleted by decades of refusing rest that doctors insisted was necessary, and he insisted was optional. The property itself remains immaculate, its maintenance staff increased to compensate for owners' reduced oversight, its gardens tended with military precision to standards Giorgio established decades ago, and that staff maintains religiously understanding that any deviation will trigger criticism from employer, who notices every detail even as other faculties fade, whose aesthetic judgment remains sharp even when other judgments falter, who will accept cognitive decline in most areas before tolerating visual imperfection in environment he controls. Security measures continue intensifying as Giorgio's age makes him increasingly vulnerable target for criminals who might see elderly billionaire as ideal victim for kidnapping or theft. As paranoia about outside threats increases with cognitive decline, that makes the world seem more dangerous than rational assessment would suggest. As the fortress mentality that was always present in his psychology becomes more extreme when mixed with elderly persons' reasonable fears and unreasonable anxieties about safety and control, and protecting accumulated wealth from theft, both real and imagined. The villa's interior remains frozen in aesthetic moment from decades past, its furniture unchanged, its art collection displayed exactly as Giorgio arranged it years ago, its rooms maintained like museum exhibits rather than living spaces where natural evolution and changing tastes would produce gradual updates that most residences experience as their occupants age and preferences shift. But Giorgio's preferences haven't shifted. His aesthetic remains committed to principles established when he was younger and fashion was different, and the neutral minimalism that seemed revolutionary in 1980 now seems dated, though he would never acknowledge this, because doing so would mean admitting that his vision is temporal rather than timeless, is period style rather than eternal truth. The business continues operating despite succession uncertainty, generating revenues exceeding $1 billion annually, though profits have declined as operating costs increase and sales growth stagnates, and competitors capture market share from brand that remains prestigious, but no longer dominant in luxury fashion landscape that has changed dramatically since Giorgio established his aesthetic supremacy decades ago. The executives who run daily operations make decisions they once would have cleared with Giorgio, but now make independently because his availability has decreased, and his judgment has become less reliable, and waiting for his approval would paralyze operations in fast-moving industry, where delays mean lost opportunities. But Giorgio maintains fiction that he remains in control, that significant decisions still require his approval, that the business couldn't function without his oversight, even though reality demonstrates that it already does function with minimal input from founder, who occasionally reviews designs and makes pronouncements that executives politely acknowledge while proceeding with plans already finalized, because they understand that asking for approval is really just seeking his blessing on decisions they've already made and will implement regardless of whether he agrees. The villa witnesses this decline in authority that parallels physical decline, sees the emperor whose word was law become advisory figure, whose opinions carry weight from historical achievements rather than present relevance, sees the dictator become figurehead, sees absolute control give way to respectful consultation that allows him to maintain dignity, while acknowledging reality that age has diminished capacity below level where absolute authority remains viable option. It is perhaps the kindest deception that loyal executives maintain, allowing Giorgio to believe he still commands when they have already assumed command, allowing him to think decisions await his judgment when they have already been made. Fashion industry observers noting Giorgio's age and apparent decline write articles speculating about post-Armani era, analyzing how brand might evolve after founder's death, debating whether Armani can survive as independent luxury house or will inevitably be acquired by conglomerate, discussing how market would react to succession announcement, or to news that founder died without succession plan in place, essentially treating him as already dead while he still lives, writing obituaries in advance, measuring the legacy while he still works to build it. These articles infuriate Giorgio when staff members who monitor press coverage reluctantly show them to him, when he discovers that he is being discussed in past tense while still present, when he realizes that his life's work is being evaluated as historical artifact rather than ongoing achievement, when the fashion world treats him as monument rather than participant, as legend rather than competitor, as figure from past rather than force in present. His fury reflects both legitimate anger at disrespect and also terror that the articles are correct, that he has become obsolete while still maintaining the obsessive control that makes obsolescence impossible to acknowledge, that the fortress he built is already becoming mausoleum though he still breathes within its walls. The villa's isolation that was chosen is now also necessary, as Giorgio's public appearances have become risky undertakings where cognitive slips might be noticed, where physical frailty might be photographed, where the gap between public image of vigorous leader and private reality of declining nonagenarian might become too obvious to maintain through careful management and restricted access and control over official photography that shows him at best angles and best lighting during brief moments, when he musters energy for performance that exhausts him for days afterward. So he remains in the villa, working from the office that has been his command center for decades, maintaining routines that provide structure when mental capacity fades, walking gardens that offer familiar beauty when everything else seems increasingly strange, inhabiting fortress that protects him from world he no longer understands and that no longer understands him, living in exile that is simultaneously chosen and imposed, that reflects both his lifelong preferences and also his present necessities, that makes it unclear whether he is living as he wishes or merely as age requires. The staff who serve him notice changes they don't discuss among themselves and would never mention to outsiders. His increasing confusion about dates and times, his tendency to tell same stories repeatedly as if they were new, his occasional failure to recognize people he has known for years, his growing fear when routines are disrupted even slightly, his need for reassurance that things are as they should be, his dependence on others for tasks he previously handled independently, his transformation from master to patient, from emperor to elderly dependent requiring care, disguised as service to preserve dignity that reality has already compromised. And still the villa stands perfect and maintained, its gardens groomed and fountains flowing, its rooms immaculate and art displayed, its security active and systems functioning, its beauty preserved at enormous cost by man who built fortune that will outlive him, but may not survive transition to whatever comes after his death, its perfection maintained by aging perfectionist, who faces the supreme imperfection that no control can prevent, and no wealth can cure, and no fortress walls can exclude when mortality finally claims what has been built. Uncertain forever today, the villa stands in hills above Milan, its exact location still guarded secret, despite decades of speculation and occasional security breaches, when photographers capture distant shots from surrounding properties, its walls still protecting privacy that Giorgio Armani values more than almost anything his wealth has purchased, its gates still admitting only those specifically approved by owner, who sits within monitoring security cameras and reviewing approach of any vehicle or person coming toward property. He controls absolutely, except for the one aspect of existence that no human ultimately controls, no matter how wealthy or powerful or determined they may be. Giorgio Armani, at nearly 90 years old, continues living in this fortress he created, continues maintaining standards that have defined his career and imprisoned his life, continues walking gardens alone in early morning before summer heat makes exertion dangerous for someone his age, continues working from office reviewing designs that executives know he will critique regardless of quality, because perfection is achieved not through excellence, but through endless revision that produces diminishing returns, but cannot stop because stopping would mean admitting that work is complete, and completion means ending, and ending is what he cannot accept. The villa itself is worth perhaps 50 million euros based on property values in area, and mansion's historical significance and acres of grounds, and perfect maintenance and security infrastructure and art collection displayed within its walls. The building's future remains uncertain, like everything else about post-Armani era, dependent on decisions that whoever inherits will make about whether maintaining property serves any purpose beyond sentiment, whether the villa's symbolic value as place where Giorgio lived and worked justifies its operational costs and security requirements and administrative burden, whether keeping fortress makes sense when emperor has departed. An empire faces challenges that historic headquarters cannot address, whether new owners will want to inhabit spaces that are so completely expression of founders' personality that they would feel like trespassing, even if legally entitled to occupy them. One possible future involves the villa becoming a museum dedicated to Giorgio Armani's life and work. Its rooms converted to exhibition spaces displaying clothing and sketches and photographs documenting his career. Its gardens open to public who could walk paths he walked alone and view sculptures he contemplated in solitude. Its transformation from private fortress to public memorial, from billionaire's home to cultural institution, from place of isolation to place of pilgrimage for fashion students and Armani admirers and scholars studying late 20th century luxury commerce and design innovation. This museum scenario would preserve the villa according to his standards, would maintain its aesthetic integrity while making it accessible to audiences he never allowed during lifetime, would create permanent monument to achievements that might otherwise fade as fashion moves on, and new designers eclipse his once dominant position, would ensure that future generations could study his work in an environment where much of it was created, would transform prison into shrine, isolation into legacy, private suffering into public education about costs and achievements of singular vision, maintained across 7 decades. Another possible future involves sale to private buyer who would maintain villa as luxury residence, who would appreciate its historical significance and architectural quality, but would also impose their own aesthetic preferences, would update systems, and possibly modify interiors to suit contemporary lifestyle different from Giorgio's austere routines, would inhabit spaces he inhabited, but fill them with family life and social activity and human vitality he never allowed, would transform the fortress into actual home, where children play and guests gather, and the silence that Giorgio preserved would give way to noise that homes inhabited, rather than merely maintained, naturally generate. This private residence scenario would preserve the building but not necessarily its current perfection, would allow evolution that Giorgio prevented, would introduce the messiness that comes with actual living rather than the sterile beauty that comes from treating residents as museum already, would mean that his carefully controlled environment would be disrupted by new owners whose standards and priorities differ from his, whose presence would erase the austere minimalism he spent decades perfecting, whose lives would overwrite his in the same spaces, though the bones of the building would remain. A third future involves demolition or radical transformation, tearing down or gutting the villa to create something entirely different, luxury hotel, or high-end residential development or corporate retreat center. Commercial use that would erase Giorgio's personal vision completely, that would preserve only the land's value and location, while treating the buildings as obstacles to be removed rather than heritage to be protected. That would eliminate the fortress and everything it represented. That would suggest that his lifetime of control resulted in creation of temporary rather than permanent value, that his obsessive maintenance preserved nothing that outlasted his ability to maintain it. This destruction scenario seems unlikely given the villa's historical significance and architectural quality, but real estate development often prioritizes profit over preservation, often concludes that land value exceeds building value, often finds that contemporary uses require facilities that historic structures cannot easily accommodate, making demolition economically rational even when culturally regrettable, making erasure of past the price of adapting to present, making Giorgio's fortress into merely the expensive and inconvenient obstacle that stood where something more profitable could be built. Beyond the grave. The ultimate irony of Giorgio Armani's life is that the man who controlled everything will control nothing after death. That absolute authority during lifetime guarantees absolute loss of authority upon dying. That the empire built through refusal to compromise or delegate or trust others has no obvious continuation because those qualities that built it also prevented planning for its transfer. That the fortress he created to protect privacy will not protect legacy if heirs decide selling is wiser than preserving. If executors conclude liquidation serves beneficiaries better than continuation serves founders' vision. The villa stands as monument to this paradox, as physical manifestation of the contradiction at his life's heart. That success achieved through total control creates empire that cannot survive the loss of that control. That refusing to share power during life means having no one to transfer power to at death. That building walls to protect perfection also builds walls that prevent the human connections that would give perfection meaning and ensure its continuation beyond individual lifetime. And if you ever find yourself in Milan's hills, where villas hide behind walls and gates and security systems, protecting billionaires' privacy from public curiosity, you won't find Giorgio Armani's address in directories or maps or tour guides, because he has spent fortune ensuring his location remains secret. His fortress stays hidden. His isolation remains inviolate. You won't see the gardens he walks alone at dawn, won't glimpse the rooms where perfection is maintained at cost of vitality abandoned, won't witness the beautiful empty life he built through choices that seemed necessary at the time, but whose accumulated costs are only now becoming clear as age brings mortality closer. And the fortress walls cannot exclude the one invader that eventually breaches every defense regardless of how wealthy or powerful its target may be. But even unseen, the villa exists, stands, persists through summer heat and winter cold, through years accumulating while owner ages, through time that respects no authority and acknowledges no control and claims eventually what it always claims. Everything that was built, everyone who built it, every empire that seemed permanent, until the moment when permanence revealed itself as another of the comfortable illusions that life maintains, until death forces accounting that cannot be deferred. The villa will outlive Giorgio Armani, but whether it will outlive his vision, whether it will preserve his legacy, whether it will serve purposes he would approve or become something he would hate, whether future generations will remember him with admiration or pity, or simply indifference, reserved for people whose achievements seem impressive within their moment, but whose moment has passed. These questions remain unanswered as he approaches 90 years old, as his empire faces uncertain transition, as his fortress stands perfect and isolated and endangered by the very qualities that made it remarkable. That is the dark story of the Armani family estate, Giorgio Armani's private mansion.